What do a British kit car and the first Soviet automobile produced by a non-state-owned company have in common? In this video, you'll discover the story of an ambitious British-Soviet car project and what ultimately went wrong with it. To begin this story, we need to go back to the Soviet Union in 1988. Like all branches of industry, the Soviet automotive sector was entirely state-run. All manufacturers of cars and components were subordinated to the Ministry of Automotive Industry. State ownership came with its own limitations, but in a centrally planned socialist economy, there was simply no other way. But with the start of perestroika in 1985, irreversible changes began. Alongside political liberalization came the first signs of private enterprise, the very idea of entrepreneurship, which had seemed unthinkable just 5 or 10 years earlier. One such project set out to do something truly ambitious, to create a people's car under the slogan, "A car for the people, paid for by the people." It would be funded not by the state, but by private shareholders. Anyone who wished could invest. And at a brand new factory, they planned to assemble a licensed version of a foreign vehicle. Why a foreign car specifically? Because launching production of the Samara or the Tavria without state support was practically impossible. That's why they looked for a foreign-made vehicle, preferably inexpensive, technologically simple, and most importantly, suitable for a private cooperative. The chosen production site was a car factory under construction in Elabuga. It had originally been planned as a state-run plant, but by 1988, its funding had been frozen and construction came to a halt. The solution was suggested by the spirit of the times. The idea was to form a classic joint stock company in which anyone could become a shareholder. This led to the creation of the Business Cooperation Association Avtokam, which united nearly 40 Soviet enterprises. They had figured out who would produce the car and where. The main question remained, what exactly to produce? The idea of producing a licensed version of a well-known foreign car, like the Fiat Panda, was floating around, but met with a cold reception from Western companies. Besides, Avtokam couldn't afford full-scale production. It would have required enormous resources. Perhaps due to their detachment from the realities of the Soviet auto industry, Avtokam's leadership made a rather unexpected choice. They decided to launch knockdown assembly of a small British car, the Rickman Ranger, naturally in a left-hand drive version, as was standard in the USSR. This vehicle was designed by brothers Derek and Don Rickman, known for their small batch motorcycles. By that time, the rights to produce the Ranger belonged to FSV International Limited, which was selling it as a kit, a set of parts for home assembly. What made this car special? First and foremost, its concept. It was a body-on-frame, rear-wheel drive vehicle, with the appearance of an off-roader, built on Ford Escort Mk2 components. Its main feature was complete simplicity in assembly. A fiberglass body, no complex systems, and minimal tools required. A toy for grown-ups. A big kit you could put together right in your garage. That's why ease of assembly was at the heart of the design. The car was made to be built without specialized equipment. Despite some visual similarities to the Suzuki Samurai, the Rickmans didn't copy the Japanese model. The Ranger had an original body with no shared panels at all. Avtokam planned to purchase kit sets, in other words, vehicle assembly packages, and build Rickman Rangers from them, to be sold to anyone interested. However, according to the agreement with the British side, about 70% of the assembled vehicles were to be shipped back to the UK and sold there as finished cars. This adventurous scheme was justified by the low cost of Soviet labor. But considering that the Rickman was originally a kit car, a vehicle designed for DIY assembly in one's garage, the feasibility of assembling it in the USSR seems highly questionable, and the choice of the vehicle itself also raises eyebrows. Think about it. A small batch, somewhat makeshift kit car built on borrowed components, styled like an off-roader but with rear-wheel drive and only two doors. Let's just say not the most practical vehicle. On the plus side, it had a body-on-frame construction and a fiberglass body that didn't rust, features that could potentially make it long-lasting. Rumors circulated that this odd choice, along with the murky re-import scheme, was tied to kickbacks from FSV International Ltd. Allegedly, this was the real reason Rickman ended up on Avtokam's radar. Still, the company didn't plan to stop at simple knockdown assembly. There were ambitions to localize production over time, including building their own frames, bodies, and other parts. Buyers would be able to choose from several Ford-sourced engines, inline fours ranging from 1.6 to 2.0 liters. In addition to the standard short wheelbase three-door version, other variants existed, such as a convertible with a soft, removable top, and an extended wheelbase model with 3 rows of seats. There was even a camper version based on the long chassis called the Rancher. In the USSR, however, only the standard short wheelbase hardtop Rickman was planned for production, arguably the most suitable option for local conditions. The vehicle was officially presented in the spring of 1991 at the launch of the Toyma assembly plant in Naberezhny Chelny. The presentation drew a lot of attention, both from potential buyers and from the press. It was one of the first attempts at private car manufacturing in a country that was changing before everyone's eyes. At that point, just 2 months remained before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Soon, a second assembly facility was launched. This one was meant to become the main production hub. The plan was ambitious, up to 20,000 Rangers per year, and by 1993, all Avtokam plants were expected to produce around 100,000 vehicles annually. A bold goal, especially considering the original Rickman was essentially a low-volume, semi-handmade kit car. In reality, things turned out much smaller. Only about a dozen kits arrived in the country, a few fully assembled units were shipped from England, and the rest were built locally, 1 or 2 per day, often using improvised tools. The first kits came with no documentation at all, and assembly had to be done blindly, through trial and error. In the first year, only about 50 cars were completed. The initial contract with FSV International Ltd. Was worth around $5 million, a significant sum even by today's standards. It included 1,000 fully paid kits. In reality, only 50 of those ever arrived. After that, the leadership of the British company simply vanished. Eventually, the culprits were found. One of FSV's directors was sentenced to 5 years in prison by a British court. But the money, it was never returned. The British side later claimed that part of their funds had been frozen in the collapsing Soviet financial system, and that they were merely recovering their losses. You'd think the story ended there, but no. In Russia, they decided to push forward. The company's leadership rushed to Russify the British car. They began using domestic components and launched production of fiberglass body panels locally. As the mechanical base, they chose parts from the Moskvich, engine, gearbox, axles. Everything was made in the USSR. There were even plans to buy Ford components directly from European suppliers. The cars with Russian components were tested at the Dmitrov Proving Ground. They received official certification and were designated as Avtokam 2160. But by mid-1993, only about 50 units had been built, even though the company's management was still dreaming in thousands. In 1995, a new headline appeared. Avtokam had changed ownership. The new owner was a Russian-Austrian joint venture called Mende Rossi, which continued assembling Rangers at the Toyma plant until mid-1997. But the story still wasn't over. Even before the change in ownership, the rights to build the car were transferred to the Velta plant in Perm, one of the project's shareholders, which had supplied suspension components for the Moskvich family. Between 1993 and 1994, Velta assembled about 30 vehicles with their own frames and bodies. And they didn't stop there. They developed a four-wheel drive version using drivetrain parts from the Lada Niva. The new model was named Kentaur. In 1994, the Kentaur successfully passed certification and even underwent a crash test. But, as so often happens, there was no money to launch it into series production. Only 10 Kentaurs were built. Just one survived to this day, and one more bare body was found in an abandoned workshop. The remaining 20 vehicles built in Perm were rear-wheel drive versions. The last original Avtokam 2160 was assembled in 1999. In total, including kits supplied from the UK, just over 100 cars were produced. So what about the Rickman Ranger itself? In the UK, it never became a success either. From 1987 to 1990, it was built by Rickman, then, for a year, by FSV International, then again by Rickman. In 1993, the rights were sold to Lomax, which continued limited production until 1999. Over 12 years, around 1,000 Rickman Rangers were built in various configurations. Neither in the UK nor in Russia did the Ranger achieve cult status or collector value. In Britain, most of the Rickmans ended up in the scrapyard long ago. But in Russia, many Avtokam Rangers are still running. Not because they're rare, but because they're repairable. The fiberglass body, as intended, resists rust, and spare parts from Moskvich are still relatively easy to find. In the end, it's a strange, forgotten, yet somehow still alive, car. Occasionally, a few owners still gather for club meets and road trips.